Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. Next week, we will mark the 3-year anniversary, for lack of a better word, of the massacre at Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And Senator Blumenthal will be joining me on the floor momentarily. And I wanted to come here and speak to our colleagues for a few moments about what this week will mean to us in Connecticut and the challenge that it presents to all of us. I want to open by talking about one of the young men who perished that day, a little first grader by the name of Daniel Barden. Daniel was a really, really special kid, and I talk about him a lot when I'm speaking on Sandy Hook because I've gotten to know his parents pretty well over the years, and so I feel like I know Daniel pretty well. Now that I have a little 7-year-old first grader at home too, I frankly feel closer than ever before to the families like the Bardens who are still grieving. Daniel had this sense of uncanny empathy that now as a father of a 7-year-old I know is frankly not normally visited upon children that age. Daniel just loved helping people in big and small ways. He was so preternaturally outward in his sympathy for others. There's a story that his dad likes to tell about the challenge of going to the supermarket with Daniel, because when they would leave, Daniel always liked to hold the door open for his family. But then he wouldn't stop holding the door open because he wanted to hold it open for all of the rest of the people who were leaving the grocery store. And so the family would get all the way to the car, they'd look back and they didn't have Daniel because he was still holding the door open. And it was just small things like that that made him such a special kid. His father, Mark, wrote one day, "I'm always 1 minute farther away from my life with Daniel. And that gulf keeps getting bigger." His mother, Jackie, in the months and years following Daniel's death, developed a habit of what grief counselors call defensive mechanisms. She would sometimes pretend that Daniel was at a friend's house for a couple hours, simply in order to give herself the strength to do simple household chores, like cooking dinner or returning emails. The only way she could do it if she pretended for a small slice of time that Daniel actually was still alive. And so it's hard to describe for my colleagues here today the grief that still frankly drowns Sandy Hook parents and the community writ large. It's total, it's permanent, and it's all-consuming. But for many of those parents and many of those community members, the grief now is mixed with a combination of anger and utter bewilderment, all of it directed at us in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives. On December 14th, Adam Lanza walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School armed with a weapon that was designed for the military, designed to kill as many people as quickly as possible. He had 30-round magazines, not designed for hunting or for sport shooting, but to destroy as much life as quickly as possible. Importantly, he left at home his lower round magazines. And the design of his weapons worked to a T. In approximately 4 minutes, he discharged 154 rounds, and he killed with ruthless efficiency. 27 people shot, 26 dead, including 20 first graders. Rachel Davino, 29. Dawn Hochsprung, 47. Anne-Marie Murphy, 52. Lauren Rousseau, 30. Mary Sherlock, 56. Victoria Soto, 27. And the students: Charlotte Bacon, Daniel Barden, Olivia Engel, Josephine Gay, Dylan Hockley, Madeline Sue, Catherine Hubbard, Chase Kowalski, Jesse Lewis, Anna Marquez Green, James Mattioli, Grace McDonald, Emily Parker, Jack Pinto. It keeps going. Noah Posner, Caroline Praviti, Jessica Ricos, Eviel Richmond, Benjamin Wheeler, Allison Wyatt. Now, there are a handful of kids that aren't on that list because there were children in Victoria Soto's classroom that were able to escape. Likely, as investigators believe, when Adam Lanza had to reload his weapon to put another 30 bullets in it. And so 3 years later, as we grieve those 26, we are still having these awful, searing questions to ponder. What would have happened if Lanza didn't have an assault rifle? Would he even have had the perverse courage to walk into that school, if not aided by the security of having a high-powered killing machine? Would less kids have died? What if his cartridges had 6 or 10 bullets instead of 30? Would more kids be alive? Would someone have been able to stop him while he fumbled with another reload? The facts of Sandy Hook are hard to hear over and over, but they're important because they should have educated us on ways that we could come together to make another mass shooting less likely. But we ignored Sandy Hook. And it happened again and again. This year, there have been more mass shootings than there have been days in the year. 9 in Charleston, 5 in Chattanooga, 9 again in Roseburg, 14 in San Bernardino. And as I sat at that firehouse with Senator Blumenthal that afternoon in Sandy Hook, as the news rolled in to those parents that the children they loved wouldn't be coming home, if you had told me that day that we would do nothing, that our response as a Congress, as a country, would be utter silence, I wouldn't have believed it. No way. But if you then told me that it would happen again and again and again, and we still wouldn't do anything, I would have collapsed in disbelief. And I'm going to tell you, that's how the families feel. Whatever you think is the best way to stop this carnage, changing our gun laws, giving more resources to law enforcement, changing our mental health system to get more help to those who are becoming unhinged and thinking about settling their real or imagined grievances with violence, do something to honor those children and adults. Do something to show that there is an ounce of compassion as we sit here 3 years after the bloody massacre at Sandy Hook. Our mental health system is broken. We've closed down 4,000 inpatient beds since the recession began. It's harder than ever for families to get the help that they need. And if you read the report on Adam Lanza, you will see a very troubled young man who was utterly failed by the behavioral health system that stood around him. Stronger gun laws do work. They absolutely would have prevented some of those kids from dying, and the data is irrefutable. This mythology that you are safer with more guns has zero basis in fact. The data tells us that in states that have tougher gun laws, they have less gun deaths. In states that have higher rates of gun ownership, they have more gun deaths. Stronger gun laws work. And to be honest, the burden is not just on us, it's also on the administration. I've called with many of my colleagues on the administration to take some steps, if Congress won't, to make sure that those that are truly gun dealers, though they might not have a bricks and mortar store, those that are selling guns with frequency at places like gun shows or on the internet, that they have to do background checks, a recognition that they're dealers just like people that have stores in your downtown are. And so my plea today, 3 years after this tragedy that utterly transformed that community, is for us to recognize that there is no other country in the world that would live with this level of slaughter. There is no other nation in the world that would accept 80 people dying every day from preventable gun violence and mass shooting after mass shooting and not even try to fix it. That's what's so offensive to me. And 3 years later, that is what is so hard to understand for the families that we represent in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And so if you don't want to believe me, I'm going to close the exact same way that I closed a year ago on the 1 year, 2 years ago on the 1 year anniversary. And I'm kind of ashamed that I have to read this letter again because every single word of it still applies 2 years later, after the epidemic of mass shootings in this country hasn't abated but simply grown. It's from a mom whose child survived. And I'll close with it. In addition to the tragic loss of her playmates, friends, and teacher, my first grader suffers from PTSD. She was in the first room by the entrance to the school. Her teacher was able to gather the children into a tiny bathroom inside the classroom. There she stood with 14 of her classmates and her teacher, all of them crying. You see, she heard what was happening on the other side of the wall. She heard everything. She was sure she was going to die that day, and she didn't want to die for Christmas. Imagine what that must have been like. She struggles nightly with nightmares, difficulty falling asleep, and being afraid to go anywhere in her own home. At school, she becomes withdrawn, crying daily, covering her ears when it gets too loud, and waiting for this to happen again. She is 6, and we are furious. Furious that 26 families must suffer with grief so deep and so wide that it's unimaginable. Furious that the innocence and safety of my children's lives has been taken. Furious that someone had access to the type of weapon used in this massacre. Furious that gun makers make ammunition with such high rounds and our government does nothing to stop them. Furious that the ban on assault weapons was carelessly left to expire. Furious that lawmakers let the gun lobbyists have so much control. Furious that somehow someone's right to own a gun is more important than my child's right to life. Furious that lawmakers are too scared to take a stand. She writes, I ask you to think about your choices. Look at the pictures of the 26 innocent lives taken so needlessly and wastefully, using a weapon that never should have been in the hands of civilians. Really think. Changing the laws may inconvenience some gun owners, but it may also save a life, perhaps a life that is dear to me or you. Are you really willing to risk it? You, speaking to us, have a responsibility and an obligation to act now and change the laws. I hope and I pray that you do not fail. I yield the floor.